led to the theories around kincentricity. And then finally, Karen Stander, who's a local person in Riebeek-West, who's also an artist, and she referred me to this book by Alexei Kokos and Exploring Art for Perspective Transformation, which has been very, very helpful and almost instrumental in shaping my ideas around the use of Therianthropes in transformative learning and in this whole process of changing the human-nature relationships. So what's then, having stood on the shoulders of these giants, what is the originality in this? And so first of all, there are aspects of that overall proposition that I mentioned in the beginning that are original. I'm not going to go into the details of that now because it will take too long to explain, but it become apparent during the presentation. Secondly, in the use of Therianthropes as the means and measure of transformative learning. So as far as I'm aware, there are no other people who are talking about Therianthropes in this way and how they could be used. And then finally, the typology of human nature relationships and why I pick one particular human nature relationship as being relevant for this process of transformative learning in the work that I've been doing. So let's start with part one, which is what is transformative learning. Transformative learning is really a learning which has an emancipatory outcome. And I hesitate to give you a full history of transformative learning, but I guess that part of the history of transformative learning arises from the Frankfurt School and the whole development of critical thinking, which was picked up by Habermas and then later by Mezirow. And so particularly Habermas in his critique of or development of critical thinking into what he called emancipatory learning, which is learning directed at people who are oppressed within present systems and who benefit, if you like, from a process of emancipatory learning. So I'm not good on sentences. I'm much better in pictures. And this distinguishes really between what you might call instrumental or single loop learning, and then the deep learning, which is what you could also call emancipatory learning. And the important difference here is that single loop learning is something that we do regularly and without a great deal of trouble. So let me give you the example of learning how to hit a nail into a piece of wood or into the wall. So there's certain aspects that you would learn about doing that. First of all, you need to hit the nail on the head and not on your finger. On the head of the nail and not hit your finger. The harder you hit the nail, the quicker it's going to go into the wall or into the piece of wood. So there are a whole bunch of aspects around that learning cycle or learning loop in which you undertake an action, it has a consequence, and that then becomes embedded in your memory as something that has a causative relationship, and that you can draw on that learning in the future so that you don't have to repeat the mistakes of the past. That's what we would call single loop or instrumental learning. But double loop or deep learning is a completely different process. It requires a process of self-reflection. It requires a process of really questioning the system of values, your ideologies, what I call the ideological assemblage in your lives or in your persona, which governs your rules and which governs the way in which you interact with other people, it governs the kinds of actions that you do at a fundamental level. And so I have this, I think, quite a useful summary of the difference between the two. So it's easier to understand the difference, understand deep learning by seeing it opposite single loop learning. And deep learning then is transformative. It has an emancipatory component generally. It's education for complex problem solving. And quite often, it's an emotional and experiential form of learning. In other words, it's phenomenological. And you have to then compare that, or it's useful to compare that to single loop learning, which is the instrumental informative learning that conforms to one's value systems. And I use the term there of banking education because this is an alternative to the expression of instrumental education, meaning that you learn skills and techniques and values which have an application in a market or in a society. In other words, these are things that you can apply. A civil engineer would learn various processes in order to build bridges. An electrical engineer might learn processes to install electrical systems. So these are skills and capabilities and that have a direct application in an instrumental fashion within a particular context. The other thing about single loop learning versus deep learning is that it's single loop normally applies to an object. So that in the example that I gave, it applies to hitting the nail on the head with a hammer. The objects there are the nail and the hammer. Whereas deep learning is self-reflective, it requires critical analysis, and it deals a lot with oneself. So the starting point in deep learning is always oneself. I wouldn't be the first to talk about deep learning or to consider it. There is a whole posse, if you like, of philosophers and social scientists and pedagogical experts. So here are just some examples. Gramsci and his concept of hegemony, Adorno and Horkheimer's cultural industry, Bordeaux talks about habitus, and Mezirow finally, particularly in his formulation of the 7 steps, talks about your frame of reference. And what I refer to together, I refer to this as the ideological assemblage. So the challenge then in transformative learning is to overcome these frames of reference, these ideological assemblages. And I'm not going to talk about how to make it happen, how to make transformative learning happen. And the first thing is that you need these privileged spaces. And this is just an example of one privileged space, which is relevant to this discussion. And it may happen between an artist and an observer, or a lecturer and a student. But essentially what happens is that there's this meeting of a foreground discursive ability on the part of the lecturer or the artist, which is the ability to communicate and convey ideas in a convincing way. And secondly, there's the foreground discursive consciousness of the student or of the observer, in which that person, that student or that observer has an open mind. They are open to considering new ideas, to considering how things may be different in their assumptions and their value systems about what's important in the world. And in the meeting between the discursive ability and the discursive consciousness, there is this interactive communication, which I think in Habermas's terms, he conceptualized this in the theory of communicative action. But essentially, there's an interaction then between the artist and the observer, or the lecturer and the student. And that interaction leads to some form of learning, possibly. And that may be what we call deep learning or epistemic change. And so you need these privileged spaces to make it happen. But the second is possibly we can use the model then of Mezirow and his 7 steps to make it happen. And so Mezirow, in his formulation of transformative learning, said that there are some very important aspects, and these are the 7 steps. So first of all, there's 3 initial steps which are part of creating the conditions for change. And the first is that a disorienting dilemma. It's something that rocks your boat, something that makes you question whether your value systems are appropriate, whether they're relevant, whether they are correct, whether they are not morally and ethically incomprehensible. And that leads to a self-examination and then a critical assessment of your assumptions. And then there's the next part, the next 4 in the steps, which are taking action. So planning a course of action, acquiring the necessary knowledge or skills to carry out the plan, exploring or trying new roles, and then building self-efficacy in those. And I just wanted to make one point here, that if you're familiar with the precaution adoption process model, there's quite a lot of overlap between Mesereau's 7 steps and the precaution adoption process model. That is a model which says that the first step in learning is to be made aware of a problem. And then the second step is to accept that that problem is your problem. And then the third step is to take the necessary action. In other words, yes, it's my problem and I need to do something about it. So there's quite a lot of overlap logically between the two. If you're interested in any of Mesereau's work, then there's this publication, and I haven't referenced many of the things in this publication, but this chapter 8 by Mesereau in this book, Contemporary Theories of Learning, is a very useful reference. So just the last step then on critical theory and transformative learning. There's something slightly sinister about this discussion of transformative learning, which I just want to repeat to counter. It's not about manipulating the minds of students. It's an emancipatory and participatory process. And in that way, it takes its cue, if you like, from the Habermas's work on domains of learning, and also Mesereau, and later Alexei Kokos when she talks about transformative learning through the aesthetic experience. So it would be wrong to think that I had in mind something manipulative or Machiavellian, that the students come to us as empty vessels and I'm going to fill them with ideology. That's not what critical learning is about, or critical thinking and transformative learning. And I just want to make one final point on this slide, which is this issue about AI. So of course, we may have ignored some aspects of transformative learning over a period, but learning has now become center stage because of artificial intelligence and machine learning. And in that process, there's a lot of interrogation about what constitutes learning and whether learning, in fact, is an aspect or is not so much an aspect, whether learning is, in fact, intelligence. And so it's this overlap, if you like, between learning and intelligence, which has become very important. Before I get into the human nature relationship and changing that or considering that relationship, I think it's important also to make the point that individuals have agency and individuals are important. And in this way, and agency is important in changing things. And in this way, I subscribe to Giddens and his notions of discursive consciousness, and particularly his theory around structuration, which is a theory that says that individuals have an ability to articulate and change their knowledge of actions, and that this process is important because individuals can consciously engage with and potentially transform social structures. And so Giddens, in his theory of structuration, says that, yes, agency is important. So it is worthwhile teaching people new tricks, because those new tricks, if you like, become embedded or incorporated into their actions and may result in changing social rules. And so although we live in a structural context, where the structures are or a context where the structures are very powerful, it's still important to work at the level of the individual, because individuals have agency and can change structures. And so let's talk about one of those structures, and that is the human nature relationship. And to make the point that there are many different forms of relationships, but it is the forms of the present relationships that is a key barrier to sustainability transitions, and particularly the lack of a respectful human nature relationship. So I'm not the first to make this claim, and there are lots of similar claims by scholars working in other areas. And here is just an example of some of the disciplines from which these scholars have been working. So there's the ecofeminists who have some of them talk about the concept of toxic masculinity, but Sarah Griffin in her 1978 book wrote this book called Woman and Nature, The Roaring Inside Her, in which she outlined the principles of ecofeminism and how this relationship between how the male patriarchy and toxic masculinity results in in the oppression of women and the exploitation of nature. Then there's all the work on coloniality and decoloniality, and particularly the form of, if you like, cannibal capitalism that was sat alongside coloniality, not only alongside colonialism, but also was evident or found practice in globally, but particularly in the Western world. And there's the book by Winter, Unsettling the Coloniality of Being Power, Truth, Freedom. That is a book which deals with this issue. And then the philosophical aspect, which is that actually it's the origin of a binary between human and nature, which can be traced back to the Greeks at a philosophical level, that results in this lack of respectful human-nature relationship, and that's what we need to change. And then finally, the environmental psychologists working with nature connectedness, and even those who work in the area of environmental services and ecosystem services have also made this point about the key barrier to sustainability is human behavior in respect of the human-nature relationship. So what are the alternative forms of connectedness? And a lot of this is summarized or is described in this publication, but I'm going to come now to the core of it, which is this typology. And it's this typology which is going to lead us to the argument about which is the most appropriate form of the human-nature relationship in order to support sustainability transition. It's a 2x2, so it's a vertical axis in which we have the anthropocentric versus the ecocentric. Anthropocentric means that this is a relationship which is focused on benefiting humans, or it's a relationship which is to the benefit of humans, whereas ecocentric, these are relationships which are to the benefit of the broader ecology. And then on the horizontal axis, we have the spiritual versus secular. And so I'm going to start in the top left here, and I'm going to talk about the top left quadrant, which I've called pantheism, with the example being the religious beliefs of the Tao or Taoism. And so that pantheism is the belief that God is in all things, and God is not embodied in a human form. So God is in rocks, God is in trees, God is in the earth, in the ocean, in the sky, in the universe. And that's the fundamental belief that there is a spiritual being, but this isn't a being that has any shape other than what we see around us. And that is reflected in the beliefs of the Tao, where Tao is the life force that is present in all things. And Taoism is the belief in that. Now we can contrast that to an anthropocentric version of spiritual belief, which is where nature takes on a human form, and in this case, it would be Mother Nature. So often we hear talk about Mother Nature as a spiritual being, and there you can see what I'm saying about the embodiment of that human-nature relationship in the form of a spiritual being, which is directly reflective of the human form. And Pachamama is the example that I give there, where Pachamama talks about Mother Nature. It is a belief system that originates in South America, and it's just one example of many belief systems in which the beliefs center on if you like, a human form. God the Father would be another example, but that's that's not, it doesn't relate to human nature interfaces. I hear that the clock struck 30 minutes, so I'm going to have to hurry up a little bit. But the secular anthropocentric is the idea that the nature is nature is a provider of things that are required for human existence, including clean air, clean water, etc. And so the example is ecosystem services. And then finally, the quadrant at the top right-hand side, which is what I've called ukama or kincentricity. This is the quadrant that is, I think, most relevant to sustainability transitions. And it's the type of relationship that we need in sustainability transitions to make a change to our sustainable practices. And so the example that I've given there is sumac korsor, which is it's a system, it's a principle, it's a system that comes from Colombia and Ecuador, the Quechua people, and it is incorporated as a set of rights and values in the constitution of those two countries. And essentially, the argument there is that nature is kin, and that is where we get the term kincentricity. So sumac korsor is a set of values in which one accepts that the most important way to act in respect of human nature relationship is to treat nature, the environment, as kin. And so I put a little star there just to make the point again that this is the quadrant that we need to implement in moving forward with our human-nature relationship such that it can become more sustainable. And there's just a summary of the quadrants. Pantheism, God is in everything. Mother Nature, nature is a human-like goddess who looks after human interests. In the secular version, that the environment looks after human interests by providing ecosystem services. And then finally, the one that I think should be the relationship of preference, which is a philosophical, ethical approach that emphasizes interconnection and equality of all things and life. And the example is sumac korsor. Now, I wouldn't be the first to say that this is the type of relationship that we need. This comes from the Australian State of the Environment report, which had considerable input from Indigenous people. And the report made these comments. The health and country of people are deeply interconnected. Indigenous people care for country as kin. And then the country is reciprocity, so that in a way reflects ecosystem services, but in a bidirectional sense. Country is cultural learning, country is spiritual belonging. So that would be that's partly reflective of the top left quadrant there about pantheism, and country is holistic. So I'm now going to come to transformative learning through the aesthetic experience. But before we do that, it's important, I think, to understand that nature connection is something that has a concept, but it's an abstract concept. And in some ways, we need to measure nature connection. And I'm not the first to say that. The environmental psychologists have developed this, the diagram as shown here, which is a diagram in which it's an attempt to describe your relationship with nature. So if I were to be using this diagram, I would ask a respondent in an interview, please explain to me or show me on this diagram how you see your relationship with nature, and you would choose one of those, 1, 2, 3, or 4. Now, I taught a class in energy value chains at University of Witwatersrand a few years ago, and I used this particular diagram as an attempt to get students to first of all be conscious of their relationship with nature, but secondly to try and give some kind of metric, or how would they measure the depth of that relationship. And it was a spectacular failure. In other words, everyone chose the middle of this. No one would want to state that they were completely overlapping with nature or that they were completely separate. And so it wasn't a particularly valuable metric. And so that it then led to this alternative formulation, which is, can we possibly use therianthropes as a means and measure of nature connection? And I'm not going to do this poll, but I wanted to now introduce to you the first therianthrope in this talk, and these are therianthropes from a cave painting in the Free State area, and you can see on the right that they are half antelope, half human figures, so they conform to the definition of therianthropes. And of course, when you look at paintings of this nature, you ask the question, what did the artist have in mind? What does that painting mean to me? What do you think what did it mean to the artist? What were they trying to communicate? And so here's one example, but here's another example of a rock painting, which isn't a therianthrope, but it includes a whole collection of footprints. And intermingled among those footprints are human footprints. And if I can get my mouse to work, here's the human footprint. And there's another one. And of course, again, you should ask the question, well, what did the artist mean? What was the intention, if you like, of this rock painting? And interestingly, when we look at therianthropes from this perspective, you find all of these quadrants in the interpretation of them. So here we have our typology, and here are the various interpretations. So there's a pantheistic interpretation that the paintings are reservoirs of potency used by shamans to communicate with the spirit world. That the paintings, and then there is a interpretation which is anthropocentric. The paintings are the means by which shamans communicate with spiritual beings and particularly with ancestors, and that is the anthropocentric equivalent of the reservoirs of potency. And then there's the instrumental interpretation of the paintings. The footprints were there to teach children how to recognize the footprints of different animals, including humans. And in those paintings of the therianthropes, those were hunters wearing masks. So it's an instrumental interpretation. And then finally, there's the kincentric interpretation, which is the one shown in green there, which is that these paintings simply represent the interconnection of all life and objects. And what's important here then is the understanding that this is the nature of the nature of the ways of the world that are reflected by the artist in those paintings. And so just to give you the references then for these different interpretations of therianthropes, Lewis Williams on the spiritual storehouses and reservoirs of potency, and Sven Usman, and then depictions of spiritual beings, also David Lewis Williams, but a bit earlier in 1990. The instrumental interpretations were much earlier, Woodhouse in 1967. And then finally, what I call the Ukama or kincentric interpretation, Thornton in a much more recent period. And so the point from this little example about therianthropes and interpretation of the human nature relationship is that, first of all, it's very ideologically dependent. So the interpretations of these reflect the background ideologies of not of the artist, but of the interpreters. And so I then am led to conclude that these interpretation of these images, these therianthropes, are a powerful way of assessing normative assumptions and stimulating critical analysis. In other words, the art opens a window to background ideology, which is somewhat inaccessible otherwise. And so that leads me then to part 3, which is the idea of the aesthetic space. Just want to check the time. I've got another few minutes, so I'll be finished in 3 or 4 minutes. So just hang in there. But the problem too was that the pedagogical interventions that had been designed with the class of 2020 in energy value chains, where I mentioned that I did this work on measuring nature connectedness, that these pedagogical interventions did little to change attitudes. And so my conclusion from that work was that rational processes which are aimed to change the human nature relationships through an evidence-based set of information or set of publications, it doesn't work. And that the alternative approach, which would be the phenomenological experience of art, would be much more effective than rational argument. And that then brought me to this idea about what about using the art gallery and not the lecture theatre as a discursive space, and supported by lots of work on art being a non-verbal language, and symbols can be powerful messengers of sustainability transitions. And indeed, symbols can be the means through which that first step of Mezirow, the disorienting dilemma, can be delivered. And I just wanted to quote two quotations for you in support of this. So this is Alexei Kokos in Exploring Art for Perspective Transformation. The transformation of taken for granted dysfunctional assumptions in which we are embedded is of vital importance. But the difficulty in being able to identify, challenge, and change these normative rules is a timeless human pain which we need to overcome to give purposeful meaning to our experiences and act according to validated judgment. The aesthetic experience can offer an alternative means through which we make meaning of experience and critically reassess our problematic perspective. So that's Alexei Kokos. And then Tyson Bornamisa, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, with a very similar perspective. Art possesses transformative potential, making us not only reflect, but truly experience the world from the point of view of other species. So art and culture are the few spaces we still have in which to reflect on the fulfillment of all living species. And so that then took me to the exploration of transformative learning through art, and particularly to chapters 8, 9, and 10, if you like, of Alexei Kokos's book, and the 7 stages of the transformative learning according to Mezirow. And so the work that Kokos did said that it is possible to at least attempt transformative learning using art, but it needs to conform to these important principles, that the work of art needs to have some element of familiarity. The experience needs to be accompanied by critical discourse and analysis, which is the self-reflecting. That's almost axiomatic in transformative learning. And finally, the process needs to be participatory. So this is the second last slide, and it's just a slide to show you that this is exactly the kind of image which I think doesn't work in transformative learning, in changing the human nature relationship. And this comes from, I'm not being critical of Peter Mams, but this is an exhibition that is presently underway, I think at the University of Johannesburg. And at the top, you can see the dodos, and then standing on the weapons of war, and at the bottom, the consequences of war. And I think that this doesn't work because it is fearful. It is invoking a fear response rather than the necessary empathetic response, I think, which prevents that kind of psychological kickback to messages of transformative learning. And so these are the playful images of Therianthropes, which I think might be more effective. And it's this aspect of the evidence which still needs to be put together. And so I said that this was a proposition, and this is the proposition still lacks the evidence for the final stage. And this is exactly the final stage. So in conclusion, I just wanted to say that this was a lecture which I really put together in order to communicate the overall story, and then the initial ideas about the use of Therianthropes. There is, in the process, I've developed this typology of human nature relationships, and suggested that what we need is a kincentric relationship, and that the only way of getting to a concentric relationship is through a process of transformative learning, and that could be facilitated by a reflection on Therianthropes and their meaning in a modern world. So my last question here is this proposition naive? Am I just not understanding the world of power and politics and making this proposition? Of course, that's something that one can, I think it's valid criticism of this, that it does seem a little bit devoid of power and politics in talking about agency. I mean, the whole thing about transformative and emancipatory learning is that this was the participants were people who were oppressed. So it's specifically aimed at participatory action research, for instance. And in this case, the oppressed is the nature. It's the animals and plants and earth in nature, and it's not possible to engage them in transformative learning. We have to engage ourselves. And perhaps it's naive to assume that we as the oppressors would ever wish to engage in transformative learning of this nature. And of course, that's making the overall assumption that society is homogeneous, and that's the main issue here, that it is not homogeneous. And there are already people who are working to change this relationship, and this is just another motivation for that type of work. So thank you so much for your attention. I'm going to go back to, if there are any burning questions, but let me just go back to my interface. Sorry, here we get there. Thank you so much. I see it's 12:46, so wasn't too far along. Are there any questions? Does anyone would like to put something in the chat or raise a hand, and then I can open the mic? Are there any questions to what I presented? Here's the chat. Okay, sorry. Took me a while to find the chat. Okay, here we are. All right, so if there are no questions, it just remains then for me to thank you so much for those who have attended. Thank you for your attendance, and you're welcome to email me if you want any of the background literature, or you are interested in engaging with me on any of the topics. That would be a great pleasure to communicate with you. You can just email me at the university, david.woolwin. So thank you then to all of the attendees. Thank you, Mari, for organizing this, for sending out all the invitations and doing the admin. Thank you very much for that. And thank you to the GSTM for giving me this platform, and to the university. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.
Bye, David.
Bye. Bye.